Warning, this episode contains the background noise of Steve's snoring dog, Myrna, asleep on the studio floor. Do not adjust your earbuds or speakers, or email us complaints. No dogs were denied their naps during the production of this episode. From Beneath the Hollywood Sign takes very seriously all doggies' rights to nap where and when they choose.
All right, quiet on the set.
Camera speed.
Sound production, take one.
Action!
Welcome to From Beneath the Hollywood Sign. If you love old movies, Hollywood history, or the golden age of filmmaking, you've come to the right place. This is the podcast that talks about amazing stories of Tinseltown from another era. Hear fascinating conversations with writer-producer Steve Cubine, who quite literally lives just beneath the Hollywood sign, and actress-writer Nan McNamara. Now your hosts, Steve and Nan.
Hey everybody, we have a great episode for you, and actually it's an episode that we promised you earlier.
Yes, we had to move that because of scheduling a guest. So for the next 3 episodes, we are diving into film noir.
Marching into noir in
That's
March.
hard to say, isn't it?
It is hard to say. TCM's Eddie Muller, the czar of noir, who we all love and adore,
We love
he
him.
describes film noir this way, and I love his description. He says, film noir is all about treachery, deceit, and paranoia. You're never quite sure what's going on and who you can trust and what dreadful pitfall waits around the corner.
Oh, that is a great description.
I think that just sums it up so beautifully, this very specific film genre, which popped up mainly after World War II when this quiet cynicism tended to creep into the national consciousness. So with film noir, there's always this underbelly of darkness that just comes out to play. And within that darkness and the shadows and the neon lights and all the elements of film noir lies many stories of crime, dishonesty, adultery, murder, and mayhem. Well, we're going to dig into what constitutes film noir and give some great examples.
Right. I know this is your favorite genre.
It is. The first time my dad and I stayed up late and watched Fritz Lang's The Big Heat, I was hooked.
Yeah. And you are quite an expert on this. I know you've recommended to me many, many titles to watch. And
Well, I'm no Eddie scholar, but...
well, you're an Eddie scholar in my heart.
Oh, thank you.
So let's talk about the actual origin of the word film noir, of the phrase film noir. It literally means black film in French, but it is 100% American in terms of its origin.
Yes.
When directors started making film noir films, they were really just seen as B-level crime dramas,
just these
right?
little B crime dramas, yep.
So it wasn't until French film critic Nino Frank coined the term in 1946 that this genre of films even had a name. And many of these films were crime films that were spawned from pulp fiction novels. We've talked about that in the past. Authors such as Raymond Chandler, The Big Sleep, and James M. Cain, The Postman Always Rings Twice.
It was a great source for film noirs, yes. Like we said, there's no scholarly definition of film noir that's universally accepted, but it's generally defined as a cinematic term for low-budget, black and white films that are very, very stylized. They're characterized by distinct and dramatic lighting and jazzy music, expressive acting, these dark themes, and sometimes fatalistic imagery, which is influenced by the German Expressionist films. Mm-hmm. Now, German Expressionism was distinguished for its use of visual distortion and expression of performances to show the inner turmoil and fear and desires and all that good stuff from these characters.
Right, right. And most of the film noir films, they have what you, as you introed this episode, this cynical point of view that reflects the feelings that America was going through in the period after World War II and leading into the Cold War with Russia.
Yeah.
It really had its zenith, film noir, during the 40s and 50s. And the films dealt with downtrodden, jaded characters desperate for money or fame or respect or revenge. Popular characters in film noir are often the low-rent detective, cops, of course, crime bosses, gun moles, nightclub entertainments, and just in general, the seedier side of life,
The
right?
seedier side of life.
Yeah. But there's also the innocent, right? The innocent person that gets swept up into the dangerous situation. And
those are some of my favorites, when the innocent has to prove themselves innocent.
me too,
Yeah.
me too. There's also this ongoing debate debate among film scholars as to whether film noir is a distinct genre of film or if it's just a stylish version of a melodrama with distinctive and exaggerated elements. What do you think?
Oh, I think film noir is most definitely its own genre.
Me too.
Yeah,
Me too.
There's nothing like it.
I would agree. Let's dive into what the technical elements of film noir are. We're going to talk about photography, locations, camera work, and lighting.
Yes, absolutely. Let's start off with the photography. Mostly black and white photography. And if you think about it, there's really nothing like black and white photography to create the moodiness and mystery and almost seduction of film noir.
Yes.
This photography, it helped design this cinematic world where the stark whites and the dark blacks were almost symbolic of the good and the evil that coexist in these stories.
Well said.
And the stark light could also be symbolic of exposing the truth,
Right.
while more nefarious characters could hide in the deep shadows of the dark, which I love that.
Yes.
And in black and white photography also helped create this bleakness that supported the dark and fatalistic storylines and themes of the movies, and it helped build suspense and mystery and loneliness and this gritty horror when necessary.
Right.
Black and white photography was perfect for this underbelly world where gangsters and jaded detectives and torch singers and gamblers and all these great characters of film noir could live and love and murder.
Yeah, right. And of course, not all film noir is in black and white. Most famously, within the last 30 years or so, LA Confidential, one of
Yes.
Lindsay's favorite films, is made in color, and that's definitely a film noir.
Neo-noir.
Yeah,
Neo-noir,
exactly,
yeah.
exactly. But then during the 40s, I mean, we just watched Leave Her to Heaven a couple months ago.
That rich color
Oh my gosh.
strangely enhances
It
the action
does.
and the suspense.
It does. It really does. Other examples, Desert Fury,
Yes.
1947, and Niagara in 1953. So, as you said, that oversaturated color really helps.
Oh, absolutely. It really helps get across those dark themes. Well, another element that we want to talk about here for film noir, and it's very distinctive, is the lighting.
Yes.
Unlike most conventional films that use a standard three-point lighting of key light, backlight, and fill light, film noir often lights scenes with low lights to purposely cast these deep, deep shadows.
Right.
So effective.
Right.
And noir directors often hide portions of actors' faces in shadow to create suspense or seduction or to reveal something about a character. And a great example of this is Mildred Pierce. 1945, Michael Curtiz creates a seductive, shadowy scene as the secret affair between Mildred Pierce's daughter, Vida, played by Anne Blythe, and the bankrupt playboy Monty, played by Zachary Scott, is revealed. So when Mildred catches them together in this very seductive embrace at the beach house, they're in deep shadows.
Yes.
But they slowly move into the light as their affair is revealed to Mildred.
It's such a perfect example of how important it is in the storytelling. Lighting can also be revealing and emphasize a dramatic point. Not always about the shadows, but sometimes directors would use harsh, bright lights
Yes.
to make a statement. So an example of this is in Johnny O'Clock, 1947, directed by Robert Rosen. When Ellen Drew's character Nellie is finally exposed for playing both sides between her husband and her lover, she is lit, like with this bright, almost blinding light, as you say, like a searchlight has found its fugitive, which is such a great way of saying that.
And it's such a great use of light in that scene.
Yeah.
You really get it. The gig is up.
And what about Double Indemnity?
Oh my God. Great use of light there. That scene in particular when Phyllis, played by, of course, the great Barbara Stanwyck, when she comes to Walter Neff's apartment, played by Fred McMurray, her lover, they're plotting to kill her husband, and as she's leaving, Walter's boss, Barton Keyes, played by the fantastic Edward G. Robinson, he shows up at the apartment unannounced.
Right.
Well, Walter has to hide Phyllis behind his front door as he and Barton make small talk. And there's this moment of tension. If he were to see Phyllis and Walter together, it would immediately raise suspicion.
Right.
So she's got to remain hidden in the shadows. And when you see her hidden behind this door, bathed in streams of this diffused light that illuminates her face and amplifies her discomfort and fear at getting caught, it's just a masterful use of lighting.
Right. Another thing that lighting does is discovers the truth about something or someone. We've talked about Strangers on a Train in our Robert Walker
right.
episode. So
And Ruth Roman.
and Ruth Roman, yeah. In 1951, so Bruno Anthony, played by Robert Walker, meets tennis pro Guy Haynes, played by Farley Granger, on a train, and he talks about doing a murder trade-off. Guy thinks Bruno's kidding. This is the setup to the film. However, Bruno tracks down Miriam, Guy's
slutty wife, you can say it.
played by Laura Elliott. And she's at an amusement park, and he flirts and seduces her from afar, and he eventually follows her to a remote part of the park. Bruno flicks his lighter and illuminates her face, and that's the light that's on her face.
The light goes off.
And we see, and she really does a beautiful job in the scene of transforming from this, it's this guy that I'm interested into. Oh
shit.
Dear. Yes. And he strangles her.
Yes. Yeah. Spoiler alert.
Yeah. Sorry to laugh about that.
No, I know. We're not laughing at poor Laura Elliott's death. Another common technique that's become a film noir staple was lighting through Venetian blinds.
Yes, isn't that just bizarre?
It's such the go-to lighting symbol. But it created these dramatic horizontal stripes across an actor or a set. And it was often used as foreshadowing of prison, or to show a character who only speaks half-truths, or to show a character who is metaphorically in some self-imposed imprisonment, which I love.
Interesting, yeah.
It's done really well in The Big Heat, 1953, when Debbie Marsh, played by Gloria Graham, she's this mobster's girl. She comes to Dave Bannon's hotel room. Of course, Dave Bannon's played by Glenn Ford, and her face has been scarred from, spoiler alert, having hot coffee thrown at her by her boyfriend, played by Lee Marvin.
Right.
She asked to have the blinds closed to hide the horror of her face. And this is also symbolic of Debbie shuttering her alliances to the mob as she decides to help Dave, the good guy, bust up the crime racket that controls the town.
Right. We just rewatched that a little bit ago. It's
so good.
Such a great film.
Yeah.
Another film that uses blinds really well is I Wake Up Screaming, 1941, by H. Bruce Humberstone. So this one, again, maybe 8 months ago, we happened to catch this with Carol Landis. And it's after her death, her character, Vicki Lynn, is murdered. And her talent promoter, Frankie Christopher, played by Victor Mature, and her sister Jill, played by Betty Grable, they set out to find who killed her. And the police help. Ed Cornell, played by Laird Krieger, is the head of this case. But as it unfolds, it's revealed in the story that Laird Krieger's character was obsessed with Vicky and sets out to frame Frankie for her death. And so again, the Venetian blinds in this one particular scene, so symbolic of Frankie and Jill closing in on Cornell and foreshadowing the life that awaits him in prison.
Yes, so effective. Silhouettes are also used frequently in film noir, and this sort of intensifies the drama, and it shows the power of characters.
Yeah.
It was used in many ways as part of visual storytelling. Jacques Tourneur used it masterfully in Out of the Past in 1947 as shady detective Jeff Bailey, played by Robert Mitchum, and his former detective partner Jack Fisher, played by Steve Brody. They get in this huge fight, and watching from the sidelines is Bailey's lover, Kathy Moffat, played by the great Jane Greer. Well, the brutal and ultimately deadly fight between these two men is made that much more dramatic and tense by only seeing the fight as silhouettes on a wall next to Kathy.
Yes.
It's so effective.
Yeah,
it's so powerful.
It really is. Another way that silhouettes were used is to emphasize the magnitude of a predicament or a situation. So the long shadows of the silhouettes symbolize the impossible odds against our hero or heroine. So this is played out so beautifully in Phantom Lady, 1944, directed by Robert Siodmak. Loyal secretary Carol Richmond, played by Ella Raines, is secretly in love with her boss, Scott Henderson, played by Alan Curtis. When he's accused of strangling his wife, she plays detective to clear his name, and she goes to visit him in jail, and I just love this scene.
Yes.
He's awaiting execution. They're both shot in these long silhouettes, conveying how small they feel and overwhelmed they are by the seemingly hopeless situation at hand.
Other times, silhouettes are used to show the eerie dread of approaching danger. And this is used so effectively in The Killers, 1946, when two hired hitmen, played by William Conrad and Charles McGraw, show up at a small town diner looking for their victim, Swede, played by Burt Lancaster. Again, director Robert Siodmak shoots the hitmen as an ominous silhouette, which slowly approaches, and it's a powerful visual for the danger coming Swede's way.
Yeah, well, Siodmak really has captured this genre in so many films.
Best.
He also directed The Spiral Staircase in 1946, and he uses these long shadows to create that foreboding element of suspense. When our heroine, played by Dorothy McGuire, she's a mute woman who is being stalked by a serial killer, and she has to traverse through this eerie mansion where she's employed and has to escape her killer.
Oh, that scene where she's going down the staircase with the shadows on the wall.
Yeah.
So eerie,
So
so
good.
creepy. Yeah. Another great example of use of silhouettes and long shadows was used in Alfred Hitchcock's Suspicion, 1941. Here you've got wealthy wife Lena, played by Joan Fontaine. Well, she suspects her playboy husband Johnny, played by Cary Grant, may be trying to kill her.
You think?
Well, in this pivotal scene where Johnny brings her a glass of milk to her bedside, the long shadows of his approach up the stairs add to the suspense. Is the milk poisoned? Is it not?
Yes.
Is he guilty? Is he innocent?
Yeah.
I love how that helps enhance the tension of that moment.
Before we continue with our film noir class and talking about camera work and locations, it's time for this week's Hollywood Pop Quiz.
And the question is, in November of 2024, IndieWire named what they consider the 30 best film noirs of all time. What film topped their list? And you get bonus points if you can name any of the top 5.
Oh, good question. We'll be right back with that answer and more about film noir after this.
You know the drill. Steve and Ann will be right back, but first another stop on the Hollywood tour. Casablanca is arguably one of the most popular films in classic Hollywood film history. It has more than its share of memorable lines, too. In fact, the film had 6 quotes on the American Film Institute's list of the top 100 movie quotes. That's more than any other film on the list. The quotes with their ranks are number 5, "Here's looking at you, kid." Number 20, "Louis, I think this is the beginning of a beautiful friendship." 28, "Play it, Sam, play as time goes by." 32, "Round up the usual suspects." Number 43, "We'll always have Paris." And number 67, "Of all the gin joints in all the towns in all the world, she walks into mine." But get this, "Here's looking at you, kid" wasn't even in the script. Legend is that Humphrey Bogart had been teaching co-star Ingrid Bergman how to play poker on set in between takes. He'd occasionally say, "Here's looking at you, kid," when she won a hand. And then while filming that very famous scene, the actor spontaneously decided to drop the line in. And cinematic history was made. And now back to Steve and Nan from Beneath the Hollywood Sign.
Welcome back, everybody. But before we get further into film noir, I wanted to give a shout out to our listener of the week. And this week, we're honoring David Standing. David was so kind to actually send us links to 2 very hard to find films that featured Donna Drake. And we really appreciate that, David. And we really appreciate your email. We appreciate your support. Thank you so much.
Thank you, David.
Thanks, David.
All right, so let's talk about camera work.
Let's.
Because it really is a distinct feature of film noir, distinguishing it from other types of films. So directors like Fritz Lang, Robert Siodmak, Otto Preminger, and Jacques Tourneur were born in Europe and influenced by that European filmmaking style, which included kind of unconventional camera work. So those directors and their American counterparts used camera angles to capture the dark mood and the danger. I mean, when the angle of a camera or a shot is off kilter, you feel off kilter.
You feel totally off kilter. It's so smart.
So it really keeps the audience off balance and allows us to feel that danger, disorientation, discomfort, suspicion, and shock that the characters are experiencing.
Yeah. And a great example of this, it takes place in a movie I love called The Amazing Mr. X from 1948. And it's about this fraudulent fortune teller who bilks wealthy people out of money with the promise of connecting them to their departed loved ones. Seems Fair enough. Except it's,
It's a business.
false. There's this one seance scene where director Victor Vorhas shoots Dr. X, played by the terrific Turhan Bey. He shoots him and his victim, Christine Faber, played by Lynn Bari, from the crystal ball's point of view, giving the scene this very strange and otherworldly feel. It's a great scene and a great moment.
Whereas most films of this era were careful to balance the composition of a shot, film noir directors often placed actors in the foreground and the background to create a sense of loneliness or isolation, or to send a message about who holds the power in the scene, which is, I think, such a cool thing. A great example of this occurs in 2 O'Clock Courage, 1945. So the setup is, after nearly hitting a wounded man with her car, plucky cab driver Patty Mitchell, played by
Anne Rutherford. We love our Anne.
Yep. She tries to help him clear his name, but first she must decide if she believes he's innocent. So the framing of the scene has him in the backseat of her cab. She's at the forefront of the shot, and the audience gets to watch her face as she makes up her mind. Did she talk with you about that film in particular?
You know, she did talk about this movie, and she really, really loved the movie. She thought it turned out great. She especially loved her leading man, Tom Conway. She thought he was great. But the one thing I remember most that she mentioned was not about Tom Conway, not about the script, but it was about this supporting actress who was making her film debut. And of course, I'm talking about Jane Greer, who was then credited as Betty Jane Greer. And Anne told me that the minute she walked on set, she knew instinctively that this woman had all the charisma, all the star power to be a major, major star. And she knew she had to keep an eye on her. And I love that. Another great example of this is in The Letter from 1940, which of course is directed by the great William Wyler. And who can forget the menacing, all-knowing Mrs. Hammond, played by the brilliant Gail Sondergaard.
Yes.
She's always lurking in the background as Leslie Crosby, played by Betty Davis, of course, is slowly brought to justice for the murder of Mrs. Hammond's husband. Well, while Mrs. Hammond ultimately has all the power, she methodically stalks Leslie like a spider, trapping her in a web.
Yes.
The lighting and the shadow really play into that.
Yeah. Another camera trick is this low angle shot. It makes things seem more substantial and powerful, or it can make structures seem more menacing. And an example of this is in The Third Man, another great film, 1949. Out of work pulp fiction writer Holly Martins, played by Joseph Cotten, of course, finds himself at a carnival to meet clandestinely with his friend Harry Lime, played by Orson Welles. Harry brought him over to Vienna for a job, but upon arriving, Joseph Cotton's character discovers that Harry is dead.
Is he dead?
Is he dead? So he faked his death and is wanted by the police. And Harry arranges to meet Holly at the carnival to explain himself. And there's this Ferris wheel shot that is
so
just
great.
Directed by Carol Reed in a manner that really overwhelms Holly and makes him feel small and insignificant, like he's a game piece in somebody else's game.
Yeah, very well said. And such a great scene and a great moment in there. And one of my favorite camera angles that film noir used a lot was the Dutch angle.
Yes.
It was a very popular shot, and specifically, it's a tilted camera shot used to give the audience a sense that something is off kilter and not right. And a great example of this occurs in Robert Aldrich's film Kiss Me Deadly, 1955. After Detective Mike Hammer, played by Ralph Meeker, picks up a hitchhiker, played by Cloris Leachman, yes, our very own Phyllis. He is waylaid by thugs. Well, they knock Mike unconscious, they kill the hitchhiker, and then Mike and the hitchhiker's bodies are shoved into the car and run over a cliff. Well, Mike wakes up, and he's in a hospital room, and he's now accused of killing this girl. And the Dutch angle shot really emphasizes his confusion, his disorientation.
Yeah.
It's such a masterful use of this particular angle.
Yeah, it's so interesting to talk about these different techniques, because as an audience member, you're not aware of what they're they're doing to sort of manipulate you.
I know. It's a little sort of a guide the narrative, and you're unaware of the manipulation.
Yeah. Another way they do this is with experimenting with focal points. So the use of rack focus became an important part of the filmmaker's technique in telling stories from two different points of view, because as we've talked about, the character, the good, the bad. So the camera would put one character in sharp focus, the other in soft focus, to emphasize whose perspective we were supposed to pay attention to. Talk about manipulating.
Yes.
So in The Narrow Margin, 1952, Detective Walter Brown, played by Charles McGraw, is charged with getting a mob widow, played by the great Marie Windsor, getting her safely to court to testify. And while picking her up, he and his partner are ambushed, his partner's killed. He and the mobster's widow escape in a cab. Director Richard Fleischer uses that rack focus to emphasize each character's narrative.
Yeah, great example of that. Another trick that they use in film noir often was the use of mirrors.
Yeah.
It could be used for many, many purposes. It could be used to show dual personality, as Robert Siodmak did in The Dark Mirror, 1946, with Olivia de Havilland playing good and evil twins. It could
Sounds
also,
like a soap opera.
Right, totally. Or it could also be used to show two sides of a character. The one the protagonist knows, and the darker side that is often hidden and unknown. And a great example of that takes place in Fritz Lang's The Woman in the Window, 1944, when Alice Reed, played by Joan Bennett, she's an artist model, and she's looking at a portrait of herself in a window.
Yes.
And while she seems nice enough, when Professor Richard Wainley, Edward G. Robinson, meets her, she has this dark, manipulative side that will lead to murder later on.
Yes.
So in that one shot, you really get to see this dual side of her.
Right. Mirrors are often used as the big reveal, as in The Lady in the Lake, 1947. Based on Raymond Chandler's fourth Philip Marlowe detective novel, this entire film is shot from the camera point of view of Marlowe, played by Robert Montgomery, who also directed. The only time that we see Marlowe's face is through mirrors, which...
I know. It's clever, but it's also very, very frustrating to me anyway.
Yeah, you just want to...
You get tired of it. It's like, okay, enough already.
Right.
Yeah. Mirrors were probably used to best effect in the climactic ending of Orson Welles' The Lady from Shanghai, 1947. And it all takes place in a funhouse. And the funhouse mirrors, there's this gun showdown between Elsa, played by Rita Hayworth, her husband Arthur, played by Everett Sloane, and her stool pigeon lover, Michael O'Hara, played by Orson Welles. And this one is one for the record books. The multiple mirrors heighten the drama and create this mass confusion as the audience tries to figure out who has shot whom.
Right. Often film noir directors use a combination of lighting, camera work, and black and white photography, as we've just described them, to create the perfect mood. A good example of this is in the Charles Laughton-directed film Night of the Hunter, 1955.
Yes.
Two orphaned children, Billy Chapin and Sally Jane Bruce,
who we actually covered when we did Child Actors several months ago.
Right. They're stalked by Reverend Harry Powell, who is this deranged minister played by none other than Robert Mitchum. Powell knows their father hid $10,000 in the little girl's doll. It reminds me of Wait Until Dark.
Yeah, totally.
A little different.
Yes.
The children seek refuge with Miss Rachel, played by Lillian Gish, a tough woman who takes in orphans. And when Powell tracks them to Miss Rachel's house, he has met his match.
Yes, he has.
So there's this tense scene where Rachel waits up all night with a gun on the front porch, and Laughton not only uses dramatic lighting to build the suspense, but he also employs the use of these other things we've talked about: silhouette, long shadows, and an off-balanced positioning of the characters that clearly shows Rachel is in charge. It's a beautiful scene.
Yeah, it really masterful. It really is. Another element, moving on, that is used effectively in film noir are locations.
Yes.
Usually the big city. That's where all the dreamers go, or so it seems. And the big city's also where some really bad things happen.
Right, right.
Which we've seen in all the film noirs. It's a place your grandmother warned you about. Yet, like a moth to flames, we're drawn to the big city, aren't we all?
Right.
But more often than not, we get swept into the dark underbelly instead, which is the whole reason for film noir. Many film noir movies take place in large urban cities, particularly Los Angeles and New York. These cities can convey a feeling of loneliness even with thousands of people around you. The city itself itself is often like another character in the narrative.
Yeah.
Setting the action in these urban locations further heightens the drama, suspense, despair, darkness, whatever you need to.
Right.
And many of the film noirs of the day utilize sound stages and studio backlots effectively. But when they did get the opportunity to film on location, it added this gritty realism that enhanced the mood.
Right. Naked City, 1948, great example of being shot in New York City,
Yes.
directed by Jules Dassin. The film starts with this airplane view of Manhattan.
Yep.
And it ends with the city at night. But one of the best sequences occurs at the climax of the movie when the cops
Yes.
trap the murderer, Willie Garza, played by Ted DeCorzia, atop the Williamsburg Bridge. And Garza engages in a gunfight with all of Manhattan in the background. I mean, talk about symbolic,
and,
right?
and shot on location.
Yeah.
I mean, it is an absolutely thrilling scene.
I think it's really fascinating, too, to think about what they were able to do back in the day
Yeah.
on location, not like today.
What was the permit process
I
like?
know, I was going to say, right? Were there looky-loos,
I
trying to see
know.
the filming?
And another favorite example of the use of New York City in film noir happens in one of my favorites, Pickup on South Street from 1953. It really used New York City in an exceptional way, from the dangerous waterfront shacks where pickpocket Skip McCoy, played by Richard Widmark, lives, to the crowded subways where the film begins. Director Samuel Fuller made the underbelly of New York and its con men and grifters such an integral part of the action.
Yeah. Los Angeles is the backdrop to He Walked by Night, 1948. And it's a fantastic film if you haven't seen it. It's this almost like a documentary.
Yeah.
It follows the police attempting to track down a former police employee, Roy Martin, played by Richard Basehart, who's on a crime spree. And the streets of Los Angeles are really important element.
Such an important element.
It's also
Yeah.
really cool to see the city back in
Back
the day.
then, I know, I love it.
And side note, co-star Jack Webb, inspired by this docu-style and tone, created his iconic radio and later television show, Dragnet, sort of based on that film.
Yeah, I think he was definitely influenced by the style
Yeah.
of that. Often film noir movies, they use small towns or rural settings to represent freedom from the sins of the big city, as you might say. And this is where characters could go to remind themselves of who they were before being seduced and made cynical by the city. These settings were often used to represent peace and purity for the characters. In the Arthur Lupin-directed film Impact from 1949, wealthy San Francisco industrialist Walter Williams, played by the great Brian Donlevy, narrowly escapes being killed by the lover of his duplicitous wife Irene, played by Helen Walker, and by happenstance, he ends up in this small town where he finds peace and solace with Marcia Peters, played by Ella Raines, a young widow who owns the local gas station. She gives him the strength to go back to the big city and incriminate his lying, cheating wife.
Director John Huston gives us a really good example of a rural setting symbolizing the innocence of a character's past. And it's in the final scene.
One of my favorite scenes of any film noir.
Yeah, Asphalt Jungle, 1950. Dix Handley, played by Sterling Hayden. He gets swept up in this jewel theft, and he's got to get enough money to buy back his family's Kentucky horse farm that they lost. And the whole thing just blows up and
terribly awry.
You just know it's not going to go well.
Not going to end well.
Right? So, but he's too deep in, and he experiences a battle of consciousness that really haunts him. In the end, he's wounded. He's been shot. He's desperate. He somehow manages to make it back home to his family farm with this gunshot in his gut. I don't know
and
how
Gene
he managed to
Hagen
do
by
that.
his side.
But the place of his innocence is where he lands before his life became corrupted. And he runs into the pasture with his beloved horses and dies where he was happiest.
Oh, it's such a beautiful moment. Oh,
yeah.
It still makes me teary.
Yeah. Well, this has been such a great intro to film noir. Now, our next episode is going to get into the nitty-gritty of the archetypes of all the different characters.
I love it. I can't wait.
From the femme fatales to the
gangsters and the hoodlums and the crooked cops.
I can't wait to hear the answer to this pop quiz because I have no idea the top 5.
Yes. November 2024, IndieWire, 30 best film noirs of all time. What topped their list? And the answer, you want to take a guess?
I'm going to go with, no, I'm not even going to answer because there's so many.
Lindsay, movie? Care to guess?
No clue.
Number 1 was Sunset Boulevard.
Oh, okay.
Number 2, In a Lonely Place.
Okay.
Great movie. Number 3, we just mentioned it, The Third Man.
Yeah, that's
great
a great
choice.
one. Yeah.
Number 4, The Big Sleep. I have issues with that, but that's another story.
Yeah.
And number 5, Double Indemnity. My favorite.
A Double Indemnity. I would think Double Indemnity would have been higher on the
Yeah,
list.
me too.
Well, thanks everybody for spending this time with us. We would love it if you would follow us on social media. Our handle is @From Beneath the Hollywood Sign, and you can find us on Facebook and Instagram, and you can watch the podcast on YouTube.
And you can email us at info@FromBeneathTheHollywoodSign.com.
That's this week's view.
From Beneath the Hollywood Sign.
You've been listening to From Beneath the Hollywood Sign with Steve Cubine and Ann McNamara, the podcast that celebrates amazing stories of Tinseltown from its golden era. Join us next week for another episode and learn something else about Hollywood you probably never knew. Take a moment and give us a 5-star rating and a positive review, and tell your friends about us too. It'll help grow the podcast. Visit Steve's website at FromBeneathTheHollywoodSign.com. The executive producers are Steve Cubine and Nan McNamara. Executive producer and post-production supervisor Lindsay Schnebley. Associate producer and researcher John Price Ritchie. This podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. Visit airwavemedia.com to listen and subscribe to their other fine shows like The Box of Oddities and The Shallow End with Schnebley and Toth. Copyright 2025. All rights reserved. That's a wrap.